Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth. Tonight, we are tracking a rapidly escalating situation across the Middle East and beyond, from new military operations in Lebanon, to a power struggle in Tehran, to a parliamentary rebellion brewing in Westminster. These stories are connected, and by the end of this broadcast, you're going to see exactly how.
I'm Maya Clarity, and let me tell you, what we're covering tonight is not just a series of isolated headlines. We're watching the architecture of a wider regional war being constructed in real time. Parliaments are fracturing, civilians are being displaced, nuclear powers are being drawn in, and succession politics in Iran could reshape the entire strategic landscape. So stay with us, this matters.
We're going to start tonight in the halls of the British Parliament, because what's happening there tells you everything about how democracies respond, or fail to respond, when their governments march toward war. Then we'll move to southern Lebanon, where Israel has just issued sweeping evacuation orders affecting a massive civilian population. From there, Tehran and the question of who succeeds Ayatollah Khamenei. And finally, Pakistan, a nuclear-armed nation trying to balance between Saudi Arabia and Iran as the region burns around it.
And critically, Alex, we're going to connect these threads. Because when you look at the anti-war alliance forming in Westminster, the displacement orders in Lebanon, the succession maneuvering in Iran, and Pakistan's diplomatic tightrope, you start to see the outlines of a conflict that could define the next decade. This is not contained. This is spreading.
So let's get into it. First up, a rebellion is brewing in the British Parliament, and the government does not want you paying attention to it.
That's right. According to reporting from Middle East Eye's Imran Mullah, an unprecedented cross-party anti-war alliance is taking shape in Westminster. We're talking about the Green Party, the newly formed Your Party, and a significant bloc of Labour backbenchers who are breaking ranks with their own government. This is not a marginal protest movement. This is an organised parliamentary coalition challenging the UK's posture on the expanding Middle East conflict.
And let's be clear about the context here. The UK government under Keir Starmer has been carefully positioning itself in alignment with US and Israeli strategic objectives in the region. Arms exports have continued. Diplomatic language has remained cautious to the point of complicity. What these backbenchers and opposition MPs are saying is, enough. We will not provide political cover for what is happening to civilian populations across the Middle East.
What makes this alliance so significant is its composition. The Greens have long held anti-war positions, that's expected. But Your Party, which emerged from disillusionment with both major parties, brings a different constituency entirely. And when you add Labour backbenchers who are willing to defy their own whips, you have a coalition that crosses traditional ideological lines. This is not left versus right anymore. This is war versus accountability.
And the Labour backbenchers deserve particular scrutiny here. These are MPs who were elected on a platform of change, who watched their leadership triangulate on the most consequential foreign policy crisis of a generation. Some of them represent constituencies with large populations directly affected by events in the Middle East, communities with family in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the wider region. Their constituents are not asking for carefully worded statements. They're asking why British-made weapons are being used in operations that displace hundreds of thousands of civilians.
The parliamentary mechanics of this are fascinating, Alex. What Middle East Eye's reporting reveals is that this isn't just about symbolic votes or early-day motions that go nowhere. These MPs are coordinating on substantive legislative challenges, questions about arms export licenses, demands for transparency on intelligence sharing, and calls for parliamentary votes on any further UK involvement in the regional conflict. They're using the machinery of Parliament to create friction against the war machine.
And who loses if this alliance gains traction? The defense industry, first and foremost. BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce Defence, Leonardo UK, these companies depend on the steady flow of arms export licenses that parliamentary scrutiny could disrupt. The UK's defence sector is one of the largest in the world, and its business model requires political consensus around military engagement. An organised anti-war bloc in Parliament threatens that consensus directly.
It also threatens the diplomatic positioning of the Starmer government, which has been trying to maintain credibility with both the Biden, now post-Biden, Washington establishment and with European allies who are themselves divided on the Middle East. If Starmer can't control his own backbenchers on foreign policy, his negotiating position internationally weakens. That's why the whips are working overtime right now.
But here's what the government doesn't want to acknowledge: the anti-war position is popular. Poll after poll shows that the British public does not support deeper involvement in Middle Eastern conflicts. The MPs forming this alliance aren't just following their conscience. They're following their constituents. And in a democracy, that's supposed to be how it works.
The deeper pattern here is one we're seeing across Western democracies. a growing gap between what governments do in foreign policy and what their populations actually want. The anti-war alliance in Westminster is a symptom of that gap. And if the conflict continues to escalate, that gap is only going to widen.
Now let's move to the story that illustrates exactly why that anti-war alliance is forming. Israel has ordered civilians in roughly half of southern Lebanon to evacuate their homes. Let that sink in, half of southern Lebanon.
According to Middle East Eye's Heba Nasser, Israel has issued sweeping evacuation orders covering a massive area of southern Lebanon, directing civilians to leave. Now, we need to contextualize what this means in practice. Southern Lebanon is home to hundreds of thousands of people. These are families, communities, villages that have existed for generations. And they are being told to leave with no clear timeline for return, no guarantee of safety in transit, and no assurance that their homes will still be standing when, if, they're allowed back.
And let's talk about the legal framework here, because international humanitarian law is very clear on this. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the forced displacement of civilian populations. Evacuation orders of this scale, issued as a precursor to military operations, raise profound questions under international law. When you tell half a region's civilian population to flee, you are not conducting a targeted military operation. You are reshaping the demographic and physical landscape of an entire area.
The humanitarian implications are staggering. Where do these people go? Southern Lebanon's infrastructure was already strained from previous conflicts. The roads north become choked with displaced families. Host communities are overwhelmed. The Lebanese government, already dealing with years of economic crisis and political paralysis, does not have the capacity to absorb this kind of internal displacement. And international humanitarian organizations are stretched thin across multiple simultaneous crises.
What strikes me about this story is the pattern. We saw the same approach in Gaza, sweeping evacuation orders that effectively make entire regions into free-fire zones. The logic is always presented as humanitarian concern, we're warning civilians to leave before military operations. But the reality is that these orders serve a military purpose. They provide legal and political cover for large-scale operations in areas that were, until moments ago, full of civilians.
And Alex, the connection to the ceasefire that was supposed to hold in Lebanon is critical. There was an agreement. There were terms. And what we're watching now is the systematic erosion of those terms through escalating military operations that the evacuation orders facilitate. Each order expands the operational zone. Each expansion makes the ceasefire more meaningless. It's death by 1,000 cuts, except the cuts are to international agreements and civilian lives.
Who benefits from the displacement of southern Lebanon's population? In the immediate term, Israeli military planners gain operational freedom in a buffer zone that extends their security perimeter deep into Lebanese territory. In the longer term, there are those who have openly discussed permanent buffer zones, the transformation of southern Lebanon into a depopulated security corridor. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's been discussed in Israeli security circles and reported on extensively.
And who loses? Obviously, the civilians being displaced. But also the sovereignty of Lebanon as a state. When a foreign military can order the evacuation of half your southern territory, your sovereignty exists only on paper. The Lebanese government's inability to prevent this, or to protect its own citizens, is a political crisis layered on top of a humanitarian one.
The international response has been, to put it diplomatically, inadequate. Statements of concern. Calls for restraint. The usual vocabulary of diplomatic inaction that we've seen applied to crisis after crisis in this region. And this is precisely why MPs in Westminster are forming anti-war alliances, because the official channels of diplomacy are manifestly failing to protect civilian populations.
The people of southern Lebanon are not abstractions on a strategic map. They are farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, grandparents. And right now, they are loading what they can carry into cars and walking north, not knowing if they will ever come home. That is the human reality behind the headline, and it deserves to be stated plainly.
Now, let's shift to Tehran, because what's happening inside Iran's power structure could determine the trajectory of this entire regional conflict. The question on everyone's mind, who succeeds Ayatollah Ali Khamenei as Iran's supreme leader? And the answer increasingly appears to be his own son, Mojtaba Khamenei.
Middle East Eye's Alex McDonald has published an in-depth profile examining Mojtaba Khamenei and the growing speculation around his potential succession. Now, this is a story that has been quietly building for years, but the current regional crisis gives it an urgency that it has never had before. Because whoever leads Iran through this period will make decisions that affect not just Iran, but the entire Middle East, and potentially the world.
So who is Mojtaba Khamenei? He's the second son of the current supreme leader, believed to be in his mid-50s. And unlike some political heirs, he has not been positioned in public-facing roles. He has operated largely behind the scenes, reportedly close to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, involved in managing his father's political and financial networks, and connected to some of the most powerful institutions in the Iranian system.
And that's precisely what makes the succession question so sensitive. Iran's Islamic Republic was built, in theory, on a rejection of hereditary rule. The revolution overthrew a dynasty. The idea that supreme leadership would pass from father to son, essentially creating a new dynasty within a revolutionary republic, is deeply controversial among Iranian political factions, including within the clerical establishment itself.
The Assembly of Experts is the body formally responsible for selecting the supreme leader. It's an elected body of senior clerics, currently chaired by figures aligned with the conservative establishment. The question is whether the assembly would formalize what many believe is already an unofficial campaign to position Mojtaba as the successor, and whether rival factions within the system would accept that outcome.
What's critical to understand is the IRGC connection. The Revolutionary Guards are not just a military force, they are an economic empire, a political machine, and a security apparatus all in one. If Mojtaba has the backing of the IRGC, he has the backing of the most powerful institution in Iran outside the supreme leader's office itself. And that would make any opposition to his succession extremely difficult to sustain.
But here's where it gets really consequential for the current crisis. Iran's posture in the regional conflict, its support for allies across the Middle East, its direct military engagements, its nuclear program, all of these are shaped by the supreme leader's strategic calculus. A succession struggle, or even the anticipation of one, changes that calculus. Decision-makers in Tehran may be thinking not just about the current conflict, but about how their positions in this conflict affect their standing in the succession politics to come.
And from the outside, from Washington, from Riyadh, from Tel Aviv, the uncertainty about Iranian succession is both a risk and an opportunity. A leadership transition in Tehran could create a window for diplomatic engagement. Or it could create a period of dangerous unpredictability, where different factions within the Iranian system pursue conflicting strategies. Either way, the succession question is not a domestic Iranian issue. It's a variable in every strategic calculation being made across the region right now.
The broader pattern here is one of concentrated power. Mojtaba's rise, if it happens, would represent the consolidation of control in a narrower and narrower circle, the supreme leader's family, the IRGC, the security establishment. That has implications for governance, for human rights, for the treatment of dissent, and for Iran's willingness to negotiate on any of the issues that the international community cares about.
And we should note, the Iranian people have made their views on governance abundantly clear in recent years. The protest movements, the demands for reform, the courage of women and young people who have taken to the streets at enormous personal risk, all of that is the context in which this succession is playing out. A hereditary transfer of supreme power would be a direct repudiation of those demands for change.
Now, the afternoon recap from Middle East gives us the broader battlefield picture that ties these stories together. Events are unfolding rapidly across the entire Middle East. We're not dealing with a single conflict. We're dealing with an interconnected web of military operations, diplomatic maneuvers, and humanitarian crises that span from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf.
That's the critical framing, Alex. The recap paints a picture of simultaneous escalation on multiple fronts. You have active military operations in Lebanon, the ongoing devastation in Gaza, rising tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia that have now spilled into direct military exchanges, and the ripple effects reaching into countries like Pakistan, Turkey, and beyond. Each of these fronts feeds into the others, creating a spiral that becomes harder to de-escalate with each passing day.
And this is what frustrates me about how this conflict gets covered. It gets treated as a series of separate stories, Lebanon here, Iran there, Parliament somewhere else. But the people making decisions, the military planners, the diplomats, the arms dealers, they see the whole board. They understand that an evacuation order in southern Lebanon affects calculations in Tehran, which affects Pakistan's Diplomatic Balancing Act, which affects arms flows from Western capitals, which circles back to what MPs in Westminster are debating. It's all one system.
And within that system, the people who have the least power, the civilians being evacuated, the families being displaced, the communities being destroyed, are the ones who bear the greatest cost. The decision-makers retreat to their capitals and their bunkers. The civilians have nowhere to go. That asymmetry is the defining moral reality of this conflict, and it should be at the center of every story we tell about it.
Which brings us to our final story tonight, and it's one that illustrates just how far the ripple effects of this conflict extend. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed nation, is now actively navigating between Saudi Arabia and Iran as the region descends into wider war.
The South China Morning Post reports that Pakistan has invoked its mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia in response to Iran's missile and drone attacks on the kingdom. Let me repeat that, a nuclear-armed country has activated a mutual defense agreement in the context of the current Middle East conflict. That is an extraordinary escalation in the diplomatic stakes of this war, and it has received far less attention than it deserves.
Pakistan's position is uniquely precarious. It shares a border with Iran. It has deep historical, economic, and military ties with Saudi Arabia. Its population includes significant Shia and Sunni communities whose sympathies in a Saudi-Iran conflict are divided. And it possesses nuclear weapons, a fact that transforms any involvement from a regional matter into a global security concern.
The report describes Pakistan's approach as a tightrope walk, and that metaphor is precise. Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar delivered what's described as a gently worded warning to Iran while simultaneously positioning Islamabad as a potential mediator. That's an incredibly delicate diplomatic maneuver, telling Iran that Pakistan will honor its commitments to Saudi Arabia while trying to keep the door open for de-escalation.
And analysts quoted in the reporting describe this as a key test of Pakistan's emerging role in the Middle East security architecture. That framing is important. Pakistan has historically been a peripheral player in Middle Eastern conflicts, providing military personnel and expertise to Gulf states, but staying out of the direct line of fire. The current crisis is forcing Pakistan off the sidelines and into the center of the most dangerous geopolitical confrontation in the region.
The economic dimension of this cannot be overlooked. Pakistan's economy is heavily dependent on remittances from workers in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Saudi investment and financial support have been lifelines during Pakistan's recurring economic crises. That economic dependency gives Saudi Arabia enormous leverage over Pakistani foreign policy, leverage that is now being exercised in the context of a shooting war with Iran.
But here's the complication: Pakistan also depends on its relationship with Iran for border security, for energy cooperation, and for managing the Balochistan region that spans both countries. A complete break with Tehran would create security problems on Pakistan's western border that could be as destabilizing as the broader regional conflict itself. This is why the tightrope metaphor is so apt. A fall in either direction could be catastrophic.
And the nuclear dimension is the elephant in the room. Pakistan's nuclear arsenal exists primarily as a deterrent against India, not as a tool of Middle Eastern geopolitics. But the moment a nuclear-armed state activates a mutual defense pact in the context of a regional war, the nuclear question becomes unavoidable. What are the thresholds? What are the red lines? What happens if the conflict escalates to a point where Pakistan's treaty obligations and its nuclear posture come into tension?
I want to be very clear, nobody is suggesting that nuclear weapons are about to be used. But the structural reality is that a nuclear-armed state is now entangled in an escalating regional conflict through a mutual defense agreement. That should be front-page news everywhere. The fact that it isn't tells you something about how normalized this escalation has become.
The Pakistani public is divided, as you'd expect. Sections of society feel a deep solidarity with Saudi Arabia rooted in religious and economic ties. Others sympathize with Iran on ideological or sectarian grounds. And many, perhaps most, simply don't want their country dragged into another conflict. Pakistan has its own enormous domestic challenges: economic instability, political polarization, security threats. The last thing its people need is to become a frontline state in someone else's war.
And that brings us to the synthesis, Maya, because when you lay these 5 stories side by side, the pattern is unmistakable. We are watching a conflict that is systematically drawing in more actors, displacing more civilians, straining more institutions, and breaking through more of the guardrails that are supposed to prevent regional wars from becoming something worse.
Let's trace the connections. Story 1: British MPs forming an anti-war alliance. Why? Because the conflict has escalated to a point where continued support is politically untenable for representatives who answer to voters, not to defense contractors. Story 2: Mass evacuation orders in southern Lebanon. That's the escalation itself, the expanding military footprint that makes the political backlash inevitable. Story 3: Succession politics in Iran. The leadership uncertainty that both fuels aggression and makes de-escalation harder because no one in Tehran wants to look weak during a power transition.
Story 4: The broader recap showing simultaneous escalation on every front, confirming that this is not a contained crisis but a spreading one. And Story 5: Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state, being pulled into the conflict through alliance structures that were designed for a different era and a different kind of threat. Each story feeds into the next. Each escalation creates the conditions for the next escalation. That's how regional wars become something larger.
And who benefits from this spiral? The defense industries that sell weapons to all sides. The political leaders who use external conflict to consolidate domestic power. The ideologues who thrive on polarization and fear. The beneficiaries of war are always a narrow class of people who profit from the suffering of a much larger class of people. That's not editorializing. That's the observable reality of how conflicts are sustained.
Who loses? Civilians in southern Lebanon loading their lives into cars. Families in Gaza who have been displaced multiple times over. Iranians who want reform and instead face the prospect of dynastic succession under conditions of war. Pakistanis who are being drawn into a conflict they didn't choose. British constituents whose tax money funds arms that create the very refugee crises they're then asked to respond to. The losers vastly outnumber the winners. They always do.
What we're watching, fundamentally, is the failure of the international systems that were built to prevent exactly this. The United Nations, international humanitarian law, the architecture of diplomacy and arms control. These systems are being overwhelmed by the pace of escalation and the willingness of powerful actors to ignore the rules when the rules become inconvenient. The anti-war alliance in Westminster is one small attempt to use democratic institutions to push back. Whether it succeeds will tell us a lot about whether those institutions still function.
And this brings me to something I want to say directly to our audience. The complexity of these stories, the geopolitics, the alliances, the legal frameworks, all of that complexity can feel paralyzing. It can make people turn away because the situation feels too big, too tangled, too far away. But it is not too far away. These decisions are being made by governments that represent you, funded by taxes that you pay, carried out with weapons manufactured in your countries. You have a stake in this, and you have a right, an obligation, to demand accountability.
The MPs forming the anti-war alliance in Westminster are doing so because their constituents demanded it. That's the mechanism. That's how democratic accountability is supposed to work. Every person watching this has representatives who are making decisions about arms exports, about diplomatic recognition, about military cooperation. Those representatives answer to you. Use that power. Demand answers. Demand transparency. Demand that the human cost of these policies is weighed against the strategic calculations.
We will continue to follow every one of these stories. The Parliamentary Alliance in Westminster will track whether it gains enough support to force votes on arms exports. The situation in southern Lebanon will report on what happens to the displaced civilians and whether international law is enforced or ignored. The succession question in Iran will analyze how it shapes Tehran's strategic posture. And Pakistan's balancing act will watch whether the tightrope holds or whether the region's most dangerous fault line cracks open further.
Because that's what Truth Report is here to do. Not to tell you what to think, but to give you the information, the context, and the connections that the mainstream coverage too often leaves out. These stories are not separate. This conflict is not contained. And the decisions being made right now, in London, in Jerusalem, in Tehran, in Islamabad, will shape the world your children inherit.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity.
Stay informed. Stay critical. And above all, stay engaged.
Good night.